The year was 1347. In the harbor of Messina, 12 galleys drifted like ghosts across water black as ink. The crews who had sailed from the Crimea were dead, most of them anyway. Those still breathing wished they weren't. The dock workers who boarded those ships found hell floating on Mediterranean waters. Bodies twisted in final agony, flesh blackened and split, and in the shadows between the masts, rats scurried with a purpose that seemed almost deliberate. They thought they were witnessing an ending. They had no idea they were midwives to a beginning. Medieval Europe had grown drunk on its own prosperity. Trade routes stretched like arteries across continents. Cities swelled beyond their walls. Cathedrals reached toward heaven while markets overflowed with silk from China, spices from India, and silver from distant mountains. The world had never felt smaller, more connected, more certain of its own immortance. In Paris, scholars debated theology in halls warmed by braziers. In London, merchants counted coins by candlelight. In Florence, artists mixed pigments for frescoes that would outlast kingdoms. Everywhere, people lived as if tomorrow was guaranteed. The rats knew better. They had been traveling for months, stowing away in grain sacks and cargo holds, carrying passengers too small to see. Fleas. And in the bellies of those fleas, something older than human civilization waited with infinite patience. Yersinia pestis, a bacterium that had toppled empires before Christ walked the earth. It had learned to hide in the blood of rodents, to multiply in the darkness of flea guts, to leap from host to host like a whispered secret. For centuries, it had slept in the steppes of Central Asia, waiting for the world to grow small enough, connected enough, confident enough to forget that nature keeps no treaties with human ambition. The Mongol Empire had built the roads. The Silk Route had opened the doors. European merchants had provided the ships. And now, in the autumn of 1347, all of humanity's achievements had become the perfect machinery for its own destruction. From Messina, death traveled with the efficiency of commerce itself. North to Genoa, west to Marseille, ships that had carried prosperity now carried annihilation. Port cities that had grown fat on trade became the first to starve on plague. The symptoms arrived like a terrible poetry. First the fever, then the headaches that felt like hammers against the skull, the nausea that turned the stomach inside out, and finally the buboes, swellings in the neck and groin that grew black as coal, hard as stone, large as apples. Most died within days. The lucky ones died within hours. By winter, entire neighborhoods stood empty, churches filled with the dead instead of the living. Priests fled their pulpits. Doctors abandoned their patients. The social fabric that had taken centuries to weave unraveled in weeks. A Florentine chronicler named Agnolo di Tura would later write in his journal, "Father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother another, for this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight, and so they died. And none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best they could, without priest, without divine offices. Great pits were dug and piled deep with the multitude of dead, and they died by the hundreds both day and night." He buried his 5 children with his own hands. When he finished writing those words, the ink was barely dry before he too was gone. The plague cared nothing for station or virtue. It took peasants and princes, saints and sinners, the young and old with equal appetite. In a world that believed suffering was punishment and prosperity was divine blessing, the Black Death arrived as a harsh correction to human theology. Kings locked themselves in castles. Nobles fled to country estates. The wealthy bought distance while the poor died in cramped quarters. But death had grown democratic. No wall was high enough, no prayer pure enough, no coin bright enough to purchase immunity from what was coming. By spring of 1348, the plague had crossed the Alps. Italian cities that had been the jewels of commerce became charnel houses. Venice, built on water, found itself drowning in corpses. Rome, eternal city, discovered that eternity had limits. Florence, birthplace of the Renaissance, watched its future buried in mass graves. The living envied the dead. At least their suffering had ended. But this was only the beginning. The pestilence that had crossed the sea was about to cross continents, and in its wake it would leave something more than death. It would leave a world that had forgotten who it used to be, forced to remember what it really was beneath all the silk and silver and certainty. They had built a civilization on the assumption that tomorrow would resemble today. The plague was about to teach them that assumption was humanity's most dangerous luxury. History would call it the Black Death, but those who lived through it, knew a different truth. It wasn't death that was black. It was everything that came after. The merchant ships that limped into London's port in the summer of 1348 carried more than goods from distant shores. They carried whispers of cities emptied overnight, of cathedrals filled with the dead, of trade routes that had become highways for annihilation. The English watched from their island fortress and told themselves the channel would protect them. Geography, they learned, was no match for human commerce. By autumn, the first cases appeared in Dorset, a port town called Melcombe Regis, where sailors had unloaded cargo and stories in equal measure. The townspeople who gathered to hear tales of continental horror became the first to live them. Within weeks, Melcombe Regis had become a ghost story itself. The plague moved inland with methodical precision. It followed roads built by Romans, river routes carved by Saxon kings, pilgrim paths worn smooth by centuries of faithful feet. Every achievement of English civilization became a pathway for its destruction. Market towns that had prospered for generations watched their prosperity rot in the streets. In the countryside, manor houses stood like islands in a sea of dying villages. Lords who had collected rents for centuries found their tenants too dead to pay taxes. Fields that had fed kingdoms lay unharvested while their tillers mouldered in shallow graves. The feudal system that had organized English society for 300 years discovered that death recognized no obligations to earthly masters. Village after village simply ceased to exist, not destroyed by war or fire, but emptied by something far more thorough than human violence. Nature had reclaimed settlements that had stood since Anglo-Saxon times. Weeds pushed through cobblestones. Wild animals wandered through empty houses where families had lived and loved and planned for harvests they would never see. The clergy, those supposed intermediaries between heaven and earth, found themselves as helpless as anyone else. Priests who had preached of divine protection died at their altars. Monks who had devoted their lives to prayer discovered that God was not listening, or if he was, his answer was silence. Archbishop Thomas Bradwardine, scholar and theologian, caught the plague while traveling to his new see in Canterbury. He died within days of his arrival. The position remained empty for months. No one wanted to inherit a blessing that had become a curse. A chronicler at St. Albans Abbey recorded the devastation in careful Latin script. Such was the mortality that within Melcombe in Dorsetshire, as in other seaports, scarcely 2 persons remained alive out of a whole parish. The pestilence raged so violently that many villages and towns were left completely deserted, with no one remaining alive. He added, with the precision of a scholar documenting the end of the world, in many places, not enough living remained to bury the dead. The plague had exposed something fundamental about medieval society. All the hierarchies, all the ceremonies, all the careful distinctions between noble and common, sacred and secular, meant nothing when death came calling. Kings and beggars rotted at the same rate. Prayer books and account ledgers burned with equal ease. But perhaps most terrifying was what happened to the living. In some places, communities banded together, sharing what little food remained, caring for orphaned children, maintaining what dignity they could in the face of catastrophe. In others, civilization simply collapsed into something more primitive and desperate. Merchants hoarded grain while people starved. Landlords evicted tenant families too weak to work. Some turned to flagellation, believing that suffering might appease whatever divine wrath had been unleashed. Others turned to darker remedies entirely. The Jews, always convenient scapegoats for Christian Europe's anxieties, found themselves blamed for poisoning wells and spreading disease. In city after city, entire Jewish quarters were burned. Communities that had survived centuries of persecution were destroyed not by the plague itself, but by the fear and hatred it unleashed in their Christian neighbors. In England, where Jewish populations had already been expelled decades earlier, suspicion fell on foreigners, on the poor, on anyone who looked different or prayed differently. The plague had not only killed bodies, it had killed the better angels of human nature. By 1349, the pestilence had reached Scotland. The Scots, who had been raiding English border towns while their enemies died, discovered that death cared nothing for national boundaries. The army they had assembled to exploit English weakness became another vector for transmission. Soldiers returned to their Highland villages carrying victory and annihilation in equal measure. Wales fell next, then Ireland. The Celtic fringe that had resisted Roman legions and Norman knights surrendered without a fight to an enemy they could not see or touch or negotiate with. Across Europe, the numbers defied comprehension. England alone lost perhaps half its population. Some regions lost more. Entire bloodlines that had been recorded in Domesday Book 3 centuries earlier simply vanished from history. Parish records that had meticulously tracked births and marriages became long lists of burial dates. The plague had achieved what no army could accomplish. It had conquered Christendom not through superior tactics or divine blessing, but through the simple biological fact that humans, for all their cathedrals and kingdoms and carefully maintained hierarchies, remained animals vulnerable to the same forces that felled the rats in their granaries. By winter of 1349, the worst seemed to be passing. The surviving populations had developed what they thought was immunity. Trade began to resume. Markets reopened. The living began the long work of burying the dead and counting what remained. But the Black Death had taught them something they would never forget. The world they had built, the certainties they had treasured, the tomorrow they had taken for granted, all of it was more fragile than they had ever imagined. They had survived the plague. Now they had to learn how to survive what came after. The silence that followed was deeper than death itself. By 1351, the great pestilence had burned through Europe like wildfire through dry timber, leaving behind a continent that barely recognized itself. The survivors emerged from their hiding places, manor houses, monastery walls, mountain caves, to discover they were inheriting a world that no longer made sense. Fields stretched empty to every horizon. Villages that had thrived for centuries stood hollow, their church bells silent, their market squares grown thick with weeds. In England alone, nearly half the population had simply vanished. Not fled, not conquered, erased. But nature abhors a vacuum, and so does human society. The peasants who remained found themselves in a position their grandfathers could never have imagined. Where once 100 serfs had competed for a single plot of land, now 10 plots waited for a single worker. Where once lords had dictated terms from positions of absolute power, now they begged laborers to return to abandoned fields. The feudal order that had organized European society for half a millennium began to crumble like parchment in flame. An English manor lord named Sir Geoffrey Lutterell wrote to his brother in the summer of 1351, "The villains demand wages now, wages like free men, and threaten to depart for lords who will pay them. They speak of rights as if the plague had made them noble. My steward tells me to yield to their demands, for without hands to work the land, what good are my titles? The world has turned upside down, and I fear we shall never set it right again." Sir Geoffrey was correct about one thing. The world would never be set right again, but perhaps it had never been right to begin with. The plague had revealed something that centuries of careful social engineering had obscured. Human labor was valuable, desperately, irreplaceably valuable. The survivors knew this now, and they were no longer willing to pretend otherwise. Across England, across France, across the German states, peasants abandoned their ancestral holdings and walked to wherever wages were highest. Lords who had ruled through divine right found themselves negotiating like merchants. The sacred bonds that had tied serf to soil, vassal to lord, dissolved in the harsh mathematics of supply and demand. In the cities, entire guilds had been wiped out, their secrets dying with their masters. Apprentices who should have spent decades learning their trades found themselves promoted to craftsmen by pure survival. Young women who should have remained daughters and wives became merchants and innkeepers by necessity. The rigid social structure that had defined medieval life bent and twisted, and sometimes shattered entirely. The church, that great stabilizing force of European civilization, staggered under losses that went beyond the merely numerical. Parish priests who had survived found themselves ministering to congregations that had lost their faith along with their families. How could a just God permit such suffering? If prayer offered no protection from plague, what use was prayer at all? Some turned to extreme piety, believing that greater devotion might prevent future catastrophes. Others turned away entirely, embracing a fatalism that would have scandalized their ancestors. If death could come without warning or reason, then perhaps life should be lived with the same arbitrary intensity. The survivors ate better than their grandparents ever had. With fewer mouths to feed, there was meat for tables that had known only bread. But they also lived with the knowledge their grandparents had been spared, the knowledge that everything could end. Not gradually, not justly, not with any regard for human plans or prayers, just end. This awareness seeped into everything. Architecture became less ambitious, more practical. Art grew darker, more obsessed with mortality. Literature began to question authorities it had once celebrated without reservation. The Renaissance that would follow was born not from optimism, but from the ashes of shattered assumptions. In some regions, the social upheaval turned violent. The Jacquerie uprising in France saw peasants slaughter their former masters with tools that had once worked their fields. The English peasants' revolt followed similar patterns. These were not rebellions born of ideology, but of a simple, terrible understanding. The powerful were no more protected from death than anyone else. So why should they be more protected from consequences? The plague had democratized mortality. Its survivors began to democratize everything else. Trade routes slowly reopened, but they carried different cargo now. Along with silk and spices came ideas about individual worth, about the value of human life, about the relationship between earthly power and divine justice. The Black Death had killed more than people. It had killed certainties. Perhaps most profoundly, it had killed the medieval conception of time itself. Before the plague, Europeans had lived in a world where change happened across generations, where traditions lasted centuries, where tomorrow would resemble today as surely as winter followed autumn. The survivors lived in a world where everything familiar could vanish in a season. This new relationship with time would reshape everything that followed. The urgency it created would drive exploration, innovation, artistic expression, religious reformation. The Renaissance, the age of discovery, the scientific revolution, all of them were children of the plague years, born from the understanding that human life was brief and precious and utterly unpredictable. The demographic recovery took centuries. Some villages never recovered at all, their names surviving only in tax records and land grants, monuments to communities that had simply ceased to exist. But the psychological recovery never happened at all. The plague had taught Europe something it could never unlearn. Civilization was not inevitable. Progress was not guaranteed. The tomorrow that seemed so certain could be torn away by forces beyond human comprehension or control. In the end, perhaps that was the Black Death's greatest gift to humanity. Not the suffering it caused, but the illusions it destroyed. The medieval world had believed in divine order, in earthly hierarchy, in the permanence of things properly arranged. The plague had revealed these as convenient fictions. What emerged was something rawer but perhaps more honest. A world where human worth was measured not by bloodline or divine appointment, but by what individuals could accomplish in the brief span allotted to them. A world where authority had to justify itself through results rather than tradition. A world where change was not just possible, but inevitable. The Black Death had ended the Middle Ages not through conquest but through revelation. It had shown Europeans who they really were beneath all their ceremonies and certainties, and from that harsh knowledge, they began to build something different. They buried their dead in unmarked graves, but their questions outlasted empires.